Robert Foster. Bob, he's going to be talking with us today about his experiences and his knowledge of the Elsinore Naval and Military School.
All right, well, thank you everybody for your patience, and thank you, Kim, for this invitation to speak and share my experience as a cadet at the Elsinore Naval and Military School in 1963 and 1964. Thanks also to those of you who are attending today, because just by being here, you're showing your interest in the school's part of the history of Lake Elsinore. For the next 45 minutes, we'll look at pictures, facts, and figures about the school that Colonel Glenn Conklin started in 1933. And we'll hear about the boys who marched in the Sunday afternoon parades for 44 years. We'll see why the boys were sent to military school. And contrary to popular belief, not everybody was sent there just because they had a legal problem or a police problem. There were lots of other bad reasons. We'll learn about the men who oversaw the boys' training, and we'll see how they kept the boys in line. And we'll see what the cadets did between the parades. Then I'm going to go over how much money the parents and grandparents spent to keep the boys there. We'll glance at what became of some of the cadets, including one whose family name is famous. His dad was a movie star, we've all heard of him. And another cadet who wrote a story about his brush with death in a rice paddy in Vietnam in 1968. We'll also hear about two other cadets who spent 30 plus years in prison for entirely separate offenses. And we'll go over some of the events that led to the school's closing in the mid-1970s. So let's start off with a bugle call that we heard all day long at ENMS. That bugle call is assembly, and that was the cue for 170 boys in the senior division, that's grades 9 through 12, to line up in their assigned places in a formation on the parade ground. And that's the way the day started. There were another 50 or 60 boys in grades 6 and below who were segregated in the junior school. They lined up somewhere else every morning. Now, where were the boys from, and why were they sent to ENMS? Most of the boys were from Southern California. There were a dozen or so from Las Vegas and other parts of Nevada and the senior school. There was one from Venezuela, one from Mexico, and one from Guatemala who could not speak a word of English when he arrived. The youngest, in the upper picture, was in first grade. And here are some of the reasons the boys gave for being sent to ENMS. My dad died, my mom remarried, and there was no room for me at home. My parents were getting a divorce. They sent my sister to a convent, and I ended up here. My parents were traveling all the time because of my dad's acting career and could not take care of me. My mom and I did not get along. She was bipolar and cruel, so my dad sent me here to save the day. My sister was acting up and required my parents' total attention, so my brother and I got sent here. I was changing schools and getting in fights all the time because my dad moved from job to job and I went from school to school. I got 4 B's and 2 F's, and I slugged my dad. I deliberately flunked out of another private school I didn't like, or I had trouble with academics at other schools. Now, one of the teachers told me 54 years after he had left ENMS what he thought. He said that some of the boys' parents just didn't want them around. The kids would stay on campus during the breaks from school and during holidays, or they'd go home with other kids. Now, newly arrived boys were given uniforms and their civilian clothes were shipped home. The new cadets were usually assigned to a 6-man room in Conklin Hall. That was the name of the building, named after the founder. And there was a cadet room commander for each room. None of the cadets I knew was considering a career in the military, but nonetheless, each cadet was a member of the California Cadet Corps. Now that is a state military leadership and character development program for boys. It's now open to girls. And having a battalion of the California Cadet Corps in Lake Elsinore was part of the vision of Glenn R. Conklin. He was a lieutenant colonel in the California National Guard. Now that's largely an honorific title. I didn't find any record of him having served in the active duty military. So who trained the boys? Colonel Conklin hired a commandant. He's in the top right here. That's Frederick R. Steinmetz. He had been a master sergeant in the Army Air Corps in World War II. Stationed in England, he flew 81 missions in B-17 bombers. His awards included the Silver Star for gallantry in action. That's the 3rd highest military award that the government gives. It's right under the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross. He also got the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism and 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in combat. The 4 assistant commandants shown in the picture below Colonel Steinmetz were also veterans. One had fought in the Pacific. Another was a Marine. The other 2 had served in the Army. These 4 assistant commandants closely monitored the boys. They patrolled the campus and no one knew when they were going to show up in one of the rooms. Now what about academics? Well, the classes were small. The French class had only 2 students in it. There was homework every day and mandatory study time after dinner. In 1964, all of the teachers in junior high and high school had bachelor's degrees or higher. The Spanish teacher was from Bolivia. The French teacher was from Latvia and spoke 4 languages. Our history teacher was a retired lawyer. And the requirement that teachers have a degree was relaxed after 1964. A retired school administrator told me that he had taught at ENMS in 1970 and 1971 when he was a 21-year-old undergraduate. And after teaching all day, he and 2 other young teachers would commute to Whittier College for their night classes. His salary was $400 a month plus room and board. That was pretty, indeed it was. But the consumer price index has increased 9-fold since then, so that equates to about $43,000 a year in today's dollars. But for comparison, the starting salary for a beginning teacher at the Lake Elsinore Unified School District as of 2025 is $67,000. Now, who fed and clothed the boys and took care of their uniforms and the premises? Well, we had 3 or 4 quartermasters on campus. They altered those splendid blue uniforms and also the khakis and fatigues that we wore every day. The school had a laundry and dry cleaning facility across the street, and there was a full-time nurse and an infirmary. Now, how did the boys, okay, here we see all the people who participated in that. You can see the nurse in the lower right there. The cooks prepared 21 meals a week for around 250 people. That's when except for Sunday nights when the kitchen crew was off and we had only cold cuts. And some of the cadets liked the food, most of us did not. Now, how did the boys learn the ropes? Well, there was a hierarchy in which everyone had a place, like it or not. And the more experienced kids taught the newer kids. The two boys we see in the foreground in the white hats, that is the company commander and the executive officer. They were seniors and had the rank of lieutenant. The boys were organized in squads of 10 or 11, like we see in the background. Each squad had a squad leader, who was usually a senior or a junior and was a corporal or a sergeant. The squad leaders were responsible for the boys. They had to get them to stand up straight, march together in step, and behave when they were marching. In 1964, there were 4 squads and each of 3 platoons. And each platoon had a platoon leader and a platoon sergeant, just like in the Army. Now, corporals have 2 stripes, sergeants have more than 2 stripes. The badge of rank for a lieutenant, let's see, where is that? Is a silver disc, there we go, which was worn on the collar. There were also 23 drummers and buglers in the band under the supervision of a senior sergeant. Some of the cadets had never touched an instrument before they got to ENMS, and they're still playing today. There was also a 5-man color guard that was under the supervision of a senior sergeant. And the big question is, how do you keep all these kids from troubled backgrounds in line? Well, there was no room for nonconformity. Everyone dressed the same, ate the same food, had the same haircut, and shared the same regimented style. The cadets were kept busy, and there was a system of rewards and punishments, just like in the military. The boys in the picture here were called out for a promotion or to be recognized for good grades or good conduct. Now, how were promotions determined? Well, the assistant commandants would consult with the cadet leaders, who are the 5 officers and the sergeants who were in charge of the band and the color guard. They'd assemble in the duty board, and the kids would make recommendations for promotions. And promotion was part of the boys' development, and development was part of the school's mission. Booker T. Washington made a penetrating statement about individual development. Few things help an individual more than to place responsibility upon him and to let him know that you trust him. So what does Booker T. Washington have to do with military school? Well, everything, because Booker T. had mastered the art of developing people. He started with himself. He was born a slave in 1856, and he was the first head of Tuskegee Institute, where he put in place a system that taught tens of thousands of people how to read and how to develop practical and career skills. In 1964, all 5 cadet officers were seniors who had come up through the ranks over 3 or more years, and they had proven to be responsible and trustworthy. That was 5 out of a class of 22, and 2 of those 5 said that their lives had been train wrecks before ENMS. One of their fathers was so impressed with the change that the school had made in his son that he persuaded 2 other sets of parents to send their kids there. The non-commissioned officers shown in the bottom, these were the sergeants and corporals. They had been promoted 2 or more times, and they carried out most of the discipline. They wrote reports if somebody had done something inappropriate, and reports resulted in demerits. Now, what's a demerit? It's a black mark that could result in punishment. And what got reported? Well, poorly shined shoes, sloppy uniforms, dirty brass, that's the metal part of the uniform and the belt buckle, failure to shave, and being in the wrong place at the wrong time, smoking at the wrong place at the wrong time, and a cadet could get reported for talking when he wasn't supposed to. But the cadet had a right of appeal. And here's an appeal filed by a 15-year-old in 1972.
Cursive.
Yes, we did cursive back then. He had been written up by one of his sergeants for talking after the mess hall had been called to attention. Now, when the mess hall is called to attention, everybody is supposed to stop eating, stop talking, and pay attention to a forthcoming announcement. You're required to sit up straight with the arms crossed at shoulder level and be quiet. Well, the kid was being quiet. He was mouthing a communication of some sort. He filed his appeal, but let's see how far he got with it. He wrote, "All I was doing was motioning." Okay, well, that was a violation in itself. One of the assistant commandants wrote something in reply. He said, "Both sergeants saw you. That's good enough for me. This report will not be removed." Now, this next slide shows what happens when a kid is reported too often and gets too many demerits. This young man in 1963 had accumulated more than he was supposed to, and that resulted in confinement to the campus and a loss of his allowance, which was $1.50. That's how much he could spend on candy and cigarettes. And it resulted also in a note home to his parents. So a sufficient number of demerits could also result in marching tours, where the offender was required to spend an hour walking along the perimeter of a 40-foot square by the gym, all the while carrying a 9.5-pound M1 rifle. Misconduct could also result in a reduction in rank. One of the senior squad leaders came back falling down drunk from leave and lost his stripes. And so did another sergeant who had pushed his roommate out of the second-story window. One of the platoon leaders, a lieutenant, got busted to private on the day before graduation. Now, avoiding demerits entitled cadets to go to the movies at the Lake Theater on Saturday nights. Cadets without too many demerits could also leave campus for 4 hours on Sundays. And those who had a 3.5 GPA could also go to movies in town on Wednesday nights. Violations of the honor code, that is lying, cheating, or stealing, or tolerating someone else doing that, could result in a hearing by the honor board. Now, the members of the honor board were elected by their classmates. The board would assemble under the supervision of one of the assistant commandants, consider the evidence, and make a determination of guilt or innocence. But it was up to the assistant commandants to determine the punishment. Now, what was the daily routine? Well, everything was started and ended with a bugle call. At 6 a.m. we had reveille. I'm sure we all recognize this bugle call. Then there was first assembly, or the first formation for breakfast. And this is the bugle call. That was a cue for all 170 of us to line up in platoons and squads. There'd be a head count, and then we'd go into the mess hall. And the meals were regimented. We sat at 8-man tables, table commander at one end, assistant table commander at the other. And a cadet who had mess duty would go around from table to table and issue a command, one table at a time. Quietly rise, that was the cue for everyone to get up. And then when everyone was standing and had his chair pushed in, he'd order, quietly march out, which meant we could go to the buffet line. And after everyone had finished eating, we could leave the mess hall together, had to be together, after being ordered to quietly rise and quietly march out. Now, after breakfast, lunch, and dinner, boys who were 15 years old and older could go to the smoker's hole. That's if they had their parents' permission to smoke tobacco. That's back when cigarettes were 15 cents a pack and nobody knew what a bad habit it was. The smoker's hole consisted of 2 benches stuck together in a butt can by the handball courts. Now, between breakfast, or the smoker's hole, and the next formation, we had to clean our rooms and make our beds. The blankets had to be tucked in, taut, with square corners. And then we'd assemble and march to the classrooms, which some of you might remember were on the west end of the campus near where Grand Avenue and Ortega Highway meet. They were converted garages. And at some point in time, they burned down, so there's nothing there now. Following afternoon classes, we'd assemble in formation for an hour of instruction in military science, which involved compass and map reading and dismounted drill. Dismounted drill is marching in formation, being ordered to go left or right and stop and start and to march quickly or slowly as the case may be, just like we see in parades. We also learned firearm safety, how to disassemble and reassemble the M1 Garand rifle. And we had to memorize 11 general orders. Now, general orders are what sentries have to follow. They spell out the duties of a guard. For example, here's general order number 2. To walk my post in a military manner, keeping always on the alert and observing everything that takes place within sight or hearing. The Navy, Marines, Coast Guard still have these 11 general orders. However, the Army distilled the 11 down to 3 general orders sometime after 1971. For example, the 4th general order, the former 4th general order, no longer exists in the Army. To repeat, all calls from the guardhouse were more distant from the guardhouse than my own. Now, after military science, we had sports. We had choices there. There was soccer, or basketball, or baseball, and there was a rifle team, and there was a student newspaper called the Admiral. During sports time, kids who had too many demerits got to march their tours, taking an M1 rifle and walking around that square for an hour. There was also a glee club. Now, one of the definitions of glee is exuberant joy, but we don't see a whole lot of that in this picture. But look closely, there's one young man who's smiling. That kid was a senior that year, and he's probably thinking about getting out. In fact, most of the boys I knew did not want to be at ENMS when they were there. The exceptions were the kids who had it worse at home. And then after sports, we would assemble for mail call, which was the highlight of the day when we got letters. People remember letters before email. That's when letters were passed out, and then we went to the showers. And then off to our rooms to change into khakis for dinner. And then at 5:45 every night, dinner time. We'd assemble again and go into the dining room. And then there was a mandatory study hall after dinner. In the 6-man rooms, we all sat around a big round table on stools and do the homework. But no talking was allowed. Cadets were required to write 1 letter home each week. And after study hall, we had 45 minutes of free time to go to the gym or the smoker's hole. The final bugle call each day was taps. You all recognize this. Saturdays, that's when we had to clean our rooms, for inspection, clean our rifles, strip our beds, get clean sheets and fatigues and khakis, and pick up our dress blue uniforms for the parade on Sunday. Then we'd be free for sports, but the boys with excess demerits had to march their tours, or we could study or go to the gym, where we had a black and white TV for 170 kids. I could see it a total of an hour or two a week, maybe. There was a pool table there too, and a canteen that sold candy, Coke, and cigarettes. The boys who hadn't accumulated too many demerits could go to the Lake Theater on Saturday nights. Sometimes we'd go on a forced march up the hill. We'd march along the Grand Avenue and then up Ortega Mountain to the 30 caliber rifle range. And on Sundays,
How far up the Ortega would you go?
Probably a mile or so. Yeah. Sundays, Protestant church service in the mess hall. Yes, and then Catholic boys were bussed into town for mass.
Wow.
And then there was a $10 charge assessed every year for a chapel fee. Everybody had to pay that, whether they went to the mess hall service or not. After church, we'd have an inspection after we changed into our dress blues, and then the Colonel Stymus or one of the assistant commandants would come through and inspect each room and each cadet, making sure his uniform was in order, because getting ready for that parade was a big deal. Then after the inspection, while still in our dress blues, we were allowed to go into town for 4 hours, up to 4 hours, either with or without the parents, and then return for the parade. There were 1 or 2 dances on campus every year. And where do the girls come from? Very good question. At one dance, there was a group of Job's daughters from San Clemente. Others were girls the boys had met at home or on vacation, or they were sisters of other cadets. Now, one of the buglers met a girl at the Lake Theater when he was 15 and she was 12. They married 6 years later after he had finished his time in the Army, and they're still married, at least as of last week. So there was a senior prom, which was held off campus. Uniforms at the prom were mandatory. In 1963, the prom was at the Mission Inn. 1964, it was at a country club in Anaheim. Now, how much did this riotous cruise ship lifestyle cost? Well, in 1958, the tuition was $1,800. That's just tuition. There were extras, which were $300 or $400 a month. 1964, tuition had increased beyond that. It was $1,950 plus between $350 and $450 for uniforms and other charges. Now, the CPI has increased 11-fold since then, so if we apply that factor to this figure, that equates to $26,400 a year. But that doesn't sound right, because I have a feeling if someone could send their kids away for $26,400 a year, there would be a lot of takers. At least for the 9th and 10th graders, I can say that. By 1972, tuition alone had increased to $2,350 a year. Now, tuition has outpaced inflation. The Army and Navy Academy in Carlsbad now charges an eye-watering $60,750 a year. So all of a sudden, that misbehaving kid doesn't look so bad. Now that's according to the website for the Carlsbad Army and Navy School. And that's close to the amount now charged by St. Catherine's Military Academy in Anaheim. Now, for reference and comparison, let's look to the price of a new Chevy. Okay? You could either send your kid to school, or you could spend pretty close to the same amount and get a new car. Now, what did the parents and grandparents get for their money? I say grandparents, they're part of the equation, because somebody had to die for some of the boys to go there, literally. One of the buglers' parents used their inheritance to send their kid to Elsinore Naval Military School for 2 years. Graduates of ENMS could go into junior college and California state colleges, but entering directly into the University of California would have been problematic. That's because ENMS was not an accredited high school in 1964, but that's not as bad as it sounds. Some of the boys who had been on principal's list, which required a consistent GPA of 3.5 or higher, failed the college entrance English exam and had to take bonehead English in college. But that too is not a big deal, because in 1974, Time magazine published an article. They found that 50% of the grads, even from accredited high schools at the University of California, Berkeley, also failed the English exam and had to take English 101. And those are the kids from an accredited high school. Now, ENMS education was by no means inferior. Some of the grads passed the college entrance exam just fine. Bela Lugosi's son, who had gone through elementary school at ENMS, said that he was ahead of the other kids when he started 7th grade in the public school. And to be fair, not all high schools were accredited in 1964. The current incarnation of the accreditation process had just started in 1972 with the creation of the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. Now, what became of the cadets? One 1964 grad served in the Army Infantry in Vietnam. In 1968, the North Vietnamese Army overran his unit. He was shot in the leg, and while lying in a rice paddy, he played dead as a young NVA soldier stripped him of his watch that he had just bought. And the fact that I'm able to tell this story, this is what my friend told me just last year. That shows that he survived, of course. But minutes before that, something even more terrifying happened to him. He literally talked his way out of getting shot by another NVA soldier who came up to him and he said, "Hey, brother, I think you got me here." And the enemy picked up his machine gun and walked off and left him in the mud. What a blessing. The former cadet wrote a short article about his brush with death, which was published in 2019. I printed it out and brought a few copies if anybody would like one. One former cadet spent 30 plus years in prison for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and attempted murder. Another was locked up for more than 30 years in a federal prison for drug trafficking, racketeering, and trying to blackmail the warden of a prison into releasing him.
Where was he learning all this?
Well, should I sing the alma mater song? ENMS produced at least one lawyer, and that's Bela Lugosi Jr. He attended ENMS from 1944, when he was 6 years old, until 1949. This photo was taken on the set of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948. Now, the grown-up Bela Lugosi carved out a specialty in the law, defending his father's Dracula persona. He sued Universal Studios for infringement. The case went to the California Supreme Court, and helped pave the way for a statute that now protects a decedent's publicity rights until 70 years after his death. Now, could we cover the lens, please? These next two photos were provided by Lynn Lugosi Sparks, who is Bela Lugosi Jr.'s daughter. These photos will appear in the family authorized biography entitled Bela Lugosi, The Man Behind the Cape, which is slated for publication early this year. I ordered a copy on cloverpress.us. This picture shows the actor with his son, who was the captain of the junior school when he was 11 years old, 1949. And here's the young captain with his troops, also in 1949. Okay, we can turn the lens back, please. The school has no alumni association, but we had an all-school reunion in 2010. One of the kids who graduated in 1966 put it together, and there were 150 of us who showed up at the Pachanga Casino with 4 of the assistant commandants. And there was a tremendous feeling of gratitude for those assistant commandants, because for them to manage 170 boys like they did, they genuinely had a concern for us. And I think we were largely unaware of it at the time, but they did a fantastic job. These were all 4 very good men. Now, what became of ENMS? Let's let the staircase in the main building show us what happened. This photo of 7 boys sitting on the staircase was taken sometime in the 1950s. That was taken in March of after 1977, rather. Now, why the decline? Let's look for an answer and some facts and figures. And Life magazine is going to tell us part of the story. United States forces in Vietnam increased from 900 in 1960 to a peak of 536,100 in 1968. At least 25% were draftees. Between 1965 and 1966, the California legislature eliminated all funding for the California Cadet Corps. Why? Because as a matter of policy, the state disapproved of things military in the war in Vietnam. On June 27, 1969, Life magazine published the names and photos of 242 U.S. servicemen who had been killed in action in just 1 week. 6 months later, Life magazine ran another story about the My Lai massacre, which had happened 9 months earlier. Soldiers from the Americal division killed at least 340 people in Vietnam. The story also appeared in Time and Newsweek magazine. Now let's plug some more numbers in here. In 1964, 22 cadets graduated from ENMS. In 1968, the number was 15. Now, back to the timeline about the articles in Life magazine. 5 months later, does anybody recognize this? Okay.
Is that Ohio?
Yeah, exactly right. On May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire and killed 4 19 and 20-year-old students during an anti-war demonstration at Kent State University. The guardsmen, some of whom were the same age as the students, also wounded 9 others, and some of the kids who were wounded weren't even demonstrating. They were going to class or watching from a distance. 10 days after the shooting, on March 14th, 1970, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young released their song, Ohio was the title. It soared to number 14 on the charts. Now, through all of this, the Cadet Corps marched on. in 1972, 7 cadets graduated. On June 30th, 1973, the draft ended. Then, in 1975, in January, Colonel Conklin died. Later in 1975, our forces pulled out of Vietnam. U.S. military deaths, according to the Vietnam Memorial Wall, totaled 58,261. Now, the estimated population of Lake Elsinore is 69,300. Number of missing and still accounted for, 1,567, and the Veterans Administration estimates 300,000 wounded. Between 1966 and 1978, over 70 military schools and colleges nationwide shut down or abandoned their military format. That's according to the website of the Association of Military Colleges and Schools of the United States. ENMS was racked by the same forces that decimated military schools all across the country. This chart shows how the number of graduates shrunk from 22 in 1964 to just 7 in 1972. The school closed its doors in 1977. At least that's the best information I could find. It might have been 75. In 2004, Colonel Conklin's daughter, Diane, sold the property. She died in 2022 at age 89. Now, did the property lie fallow for 27 years from 1977 until 2004? And if it did, why? Why did it just sit there? Those are questions for another chapter. Now, here we see the front cover of a brochure that the school made available to parents of prospective cadets in the early 1960s, when the battalion that Colonel Stymus had planted in 1933 was, like the brochure says, on the march. And that march lasted for 44 years. But that's not the end of the story. The memory of the school lives on. It's preserved by meetings just like this one, and by the hours of work that all of our volunteers at the Lake Elsinore Historical Society do. Thank you for the attention you've given to the slideshow.